honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, my remarks on this—
Order. I'll just call the clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 2. Treasury Laws Amendment. Reuniting More Superannuation Bill 2020. Resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by the member for Whitlam.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I'll call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, my remarks will not be brief on this piece of legislation, as some members may wish it to be. The reason is because it's an incredibly important piece of legislation for the security of retirement for millions of Australians, whether they're retired now and or they're seeking to retire in comfort in the future. And we know, Deputy Speaker, that at the last election, retirement security was core to the reason that this coalition government led by Scott Morrison was re-elected. Because at the heart of it, the Morrison government's focus is to make sure that every Australian, at no matter what stage of life, has the best opportunity to be able to build the success of a life, get a job and a good education, have a family and build a home and own a home, and, of course, to make sure they can retire with dignity and security at the latter stages of their life. That's one of the reasons why we oppose the $387 billion in new taxes put before us by the opposition. It's why we stood up against their insidious retiree tax that sought to raid the retirement security of millions of Australians for no purpose than for their own benefit, to give them more resources should they be elected to government to splurge as they see fit. Because at the heart of it, Deputy Speaker, the Australian Labor Party does not look at Australians as individuals with dignity and sense of purpose and choice in how they live their own lives. The Australian Labor Party looks at Australians like they're a piggy bank ready to raid. Because in the end, they don't respect hard work and sacrifice. In the end, they don't understand the pride and dignity that comes with standing on your own 2 feet. In the end, the Australian Labor Party has nothing but contempt for Australians and our way of life. And the point of this legislation is to respect the effort of hard-working Australians who have put their money in superannuation on a trust that when they go back to collect their funds on retirement or before, or if they seek to roll their money in from duplicative accounts into single accounts, that it will still be there. And that if there is a low balance, that it won't simply be eaten away by fees. That it will be there so they can roll into funds and be in a position to hold the value of their work and their retirement security. And it might shock some people, Deputy Speaker, that during the Economics Committee hearings into the superannuation sector, we uncovered a disturbing and worrying truth. As chair of the committee, I myself was asking questions of various superannuation funds, particularly industry funds, and talking about what it is that they do when you have a low balance inactive account. Now, the current law says that that money should be rolled into the Australian Taxation Office so that it can be reallocated into and reunited with its recipient, that it can't become yet another piggy bank to be raided by industry funds through fees, through insurance premiums and through a loss of retirement security to the benefit of the few. And what we uncovered in our Economics Committee hearings when we grilled industry superannuation funds and retail funds was that some were using an eligible rollover fund, a system designed to protect consumers, as an opportunity to roll the funds into a new account, which effectively reactivated them, which enabled the industry super funds to then go on and charge a new round of fees and exempt themselves from the law. It is one of the most disgraceful things that I have ever seen, a deliberate and malicious attempt to circumvent the law to the benefit of organisations who are supposed to be entrusted with money. At the time, I called it the equivalent of the fees for no service moment for the super industry, and I don't take a single step back. And that's why I am so glad this government is closing this loophole, among many others should be closed in the superannuation system. Because the advantage is not felt from having eligible rollover funds as a pathway to reactivate accounts for Australian superannuants, for people who are saving, for people putting themselves forward and standing on their own 2 feet. The only benefit is to those funds and their capacity to take from people's savings to increase their cash flow. And what we are requiring is that rather than allowing this pathway where industry funds can roll money into eligible rollover funds, or equally for retail funds to do the same, the small number of retail funds to do the same, it's to say that money should be reunited through the Australian Taxation Office with the people who own it. It's a pretty basic expectation. And that reunification, whether it's through multiple or duplicative accounts, will help build the strength of the system so that when Australian retirees turn to their funds because they're at the end of their working life, that it's still there and hasn't been squirreled away without their knowledge. Frankly, Deputy Speaker, it's disappointing we have to pass laws along these lines. But that is not our choice. It is our responsibility in confronting the misconduct that has been occurring. And that's why this legislation matters. But it sits across a backdrop of many other pieces of legislation and debates and topics around superannuation that deserve further scrutiny. Why? Because people should want, and Australians do want, a superannuation system with integrity, a superannuation system that enables choice, and a superannuation system that doesn't unnecessarily raid the wages of Australians. Because on the other side of this chamber, they are completely married to the idea that there is no cost consequence on wages from increasing superannuation rates and the compulsory superannuation guarantee. They are literally staring at facts and evidence and expert opinion and denying the link. And when the evidence is presented before them, their only response is slurs and slander because they have no argument left. You just need to look at the research that's been produced by the Grattan Institute only recently, which highlights when they actually went down and did the analytical research about the impact of superannuation, that it came at the cost of deferred wage increases. So Australians today, in their hip pocket, are poorer because of deferred wages in the superannuation system. Now, there's an entirely legitimate reason or case to be made for compulsory superannuation. We can have philosophical debates about whether it should be where it is and what not. But to deny that reality, as many members on the opposition benches do, in fact I suspect all of them do in unison, because dissent or difference of opinion is not allowed. I mean, one of the first preconditions of joining the Australian Labor Party is to take a full frontal lobotomy in terms of your opinion and conform to the Borg of the collective. Is to deny that reality. And of course, we heard only last week the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Governor, again appearing before the almighty Economics Committee, when asked about these issues, again confirmed, as did other Deputy Governors, that yes, increasing the compulsory superannuation guarantee would cost Australian wage growth. So if you're in a job today, if you're an Australian in a job today, over future years you will have slower wage growth because this compulsory superannuation guarantee is increasing. Again, it's a pretty straightforward proposition of economics, but it's denied by the Australian Labor Party. So they come into this chamber and lecture every member on this side and anybody else who bothers to waste their time listening to their rhetoric. that they are standing up for higher wages while concurrently actively promoting a pathway to make sure they don't go up. That is hypocrisy writ large and goes to the heart of the empty rhetoric and ideas that sit at the heart of the modern Australian Labor Party, because in the end this isn't a debate about retirement security for them and for the members of the opposition. Just like we saw with this piece of legislation and how industry funds are conducting themselves around eligible rollover funds, it's about power for them, how they can amass and accumulate the wealth and savings of the Australian population within their influence and their hands. And anybody who doesn't understand that fundamentally misunderstands the approach. Look at it. These days, the Australian Labor Party never stands up for workers. They never stood up against Bill Shorten and negotiating lower wages for casualised staff in certain retail sectors. Never stood up against that. Whenever there's been some sort of misbehaviour by one of the unions, they don't stand up against that either, including when it affects the health and welfare of unionised labour. But watch them, Deputy Speaker, spring to their feet as soon as there is any threat to the cash cow and the influence they have through industry super. I have never seen somebody move so fast as many members of the opposition. And just before we were in the chamber earlier, we had the member for Kingsford Smith who did exactly that. And of course, amongst the grand rhetoric that he threw out about various members and how awful they all were in this chamber, the dark heart of what he was speaking about is how to protect the interests of himself and the Australian Labor Party in spite of the interests of the Australian people. That's why this bill matters, because it stops them raiding the retirement savings of millions of Australians to their own benefit to accumulate wealth and position that they control. And that's why the minister deserves to be congratulated for bringing this piece of legislation to this parliament, because it is a nefarious agenda that has been run. And the way they have sought to use low balance, inactive accounts to roll over, to reactivate, so they can take more fees and more income is not just inconsistent with the spirit of the legislation, though it is, Deputy Speaker. It isn't just that it's irresponsible, though it is, Deputy Speaker. It's that it's morally wrong, and they know it. And the law is not always a good guide of morality, but in this case, closing down the pathway for various superannuation funds to exploit the interests of Australian savers and workers who are building their own future is morally right. That's why this bill matters. That's why it enjoys the support of the government and so many members in this place. And my only hope is that the Labor Party will start to recognise that and support this legislation, because if they don't, the clear intent and the loud message that will resonate outside of this chamber is that they would put themselves ahead of the interests of the Australian people yet again. This won't come as a shock to many Australians, and particularly for the millions of people who voted for members to sit on this side of the chamber. But we need to call it out, because this is the conduct that Australians elected this government to stand up against. This is the conduct that we must hold the opposition and their interests to account. And that is the basis in which I support this bill. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.